The Kendrick Johnson story. A teenager, a rolled gym mat, and the search for truth that America has never finished. A detailed narrative. Picture a Friday afternoon at a large American high school. The school day is still in session. Students move through hallways, sit in classrooms, eat lunch, practice games. It is ordinary. It is the kind of afternoon that millions of American teenagers experience every single week. Unremarkable, forgettable, the texture of everyday young life. On January 10th, 2013, at Lone High School in Valdosta, Georgia, that ordinary afternoon ended in a way that no afternoon should ever end. A 17-year-old boy named Kendrick Johnson went into the school gymnasium and did not come out. He was not reported missing until evening, when his mother called to say he had not come home. The next morning, January 11th, a group of students climbed up onto a stack of rolled wrestling mats in the gym and found him. He was upside down inside one of the vertical mats, head first, his feet pointing toward the ceiling. He was dead. The official explanation, offered within 24 hours of the discovery, was that Kendrick had climbed into the mat to retrieve a shoe that had fallen inside it, become trapped in the narrow space, and died from positional asphyxia, suffocation caused by being stuck upside down for an extended period of time in an enclosed space. It was ruled an accident. The case was closed. His parents did not accept this explanation. They never have, and the more they investigated, the more questions they found. Questions about the physical evidence of the scene, questions about the school surveillance footage, questions about what happened to their son's body after his death, questions about who was in the gymnasium that day, and questions about whether the people responsible for investigating Kendrick Johnson's death had any real interest in finding the truth. Over the following 12 years, the case was reopened, investigated by federal authorities, investigated again, litigated in multiple courts, documented in documentaries, and still, as of the writing of this account, never fully resolved. The story of Kendrick Johnson is a story of a 17-year-old boy who deserved better than what he got from whoever was responsible for his death, from the institutions that were supposed to investigate it, and from a country that has too often looked away when a black teenager's life ended in suspicious circumstances in the American South. It is a story about a family's grief and their extraordinary refusal to accept silence. And it is a story about the gap between what is supposed to happen when a young person dies and what actually happened in Valdosta, Georgia, in January 2013. This is that story told in full. Kendrick, who he was, before the mat, before the investigation, before the lawsuits and the documentaries and the rallies and the congressional hearings, there was simply a boy. Kendrick Johnson was born on October 10, 1995, in Valdosta, Georgia, and he grew up there in the same community where he would die 17 years later. His parents, Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson, were a working-class couple who raised their family in Valdosta's predominantly black community with love, discipline, and clear expectations about how their children should carry themselves. Kendrick was, by every account of every person who knew him, a good kid. Not a perfect kid. Nobody is a perfect kid at 17, but genuinely good. His teachers described him as respectful and engaged. His classmates described him as funny and easy to be around, someone who made friends without effort. He was the kind of person people remembered fondly without having to search their memory for good things to say. He was an athlete. This was central to his identity and to his daily life. He wrestled. He played football. He ran track. Sports were not just something he did. They were part of how he understood himself and how his peers understood him. At Lone High School, which was a large school with an active sports culture, Kendrick was visible and valued as an athlete. He trained hard and took his sport seriously. He was also an honor roll student, a detail that his parents have always emphasized because it matters, because it contradicts any narrative that tries to explain away what happened to him as a natural consequence of a troubled life. Kendrick Johnson was not a troubled kid. He was not in any trouble with the law. He was not known for fighting or for involvement in anything dangerous. He was a teenager who went to school, played sports, helped around the house, and had planned for a future that he never got to live. His parents have described him as a boy who was always where he was supposed to be, at practice, at school, at home. When he did not come home on the afternoon of January 10th, 2013, his mother Jacqueline immediately knew something was wrong. Kendrick did not just not show up. That was not who he was. She reported him missing that evening. He was 17 years old. He was a sophomore at Lowndes High School. He was wearing a red polo shirt when he was last seen walking into the gymnasium on the surveillance footage that the school's cameras captured. And whatever happened to him in that gymnasium, whether it was an accident or something far worse, happened to a boy who was loved, known, and missed immediately when he failed to come home. The discovery, January 11, 2013. On the morning of January 11, 2013, the students at Lowndes High School went back to school. The gymnasium, like all the other spaces in the building, was an ordinary part of the school day. It was used for physical education classes, for athletic practice, for the daily flow of student life. At some point in the morning, a group of students climbed up onto the stack of large, rolled wrestling mats that were stored vertically at the edge of the gymnasium near the bleachers. The mats stood roughly 6 feet tall and about 3 feet wide, heavy cylindrical tubes of foam, stored upright, the way wrestling mats at many high schools around the country are kept. Students apparently climbed up onto these mats regularly. It was a kind of casual exploration that teenagers engage in without thinking. What one of those students found when they looked down into the open top of one of the mats stopped everything. Inside the mat, head down, feet pointing up toward the ceiling, was Kendrick Johnson. He was dressed in the red polo shirt he had been wearing the day before. He was clearly dead. The students who found him ran for help. Teachers and school staff responded and found the same thing the students had found, a 17-year-old boy, dead, wedged inside a rolled gym mat in the school gymnasium. A gym teacher confirmed what the students had seen. Emergency services were called. Police arrived. The gym was secured. The physical reality of the scene was striking and immediate. The mat Kendrick was found in was one of a cluster of mats stored together near the bleachers. He was found head first, inverted, with his body pushed deep enough into the mat that only his feet were visible from above. His shoes, the shoes the official investigation would later suggest he had been reaching for, were found not inside the mat but outside it, near the base of the cluster, near a small pool of blood. This detail, the blood on the floor outside the mat, and the fact that the shoe Kendrick was supposedly reaching for was found beside the blood rather than inside the mat, was one of the first things that troubled his family and independent investigators in the months to come. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office took charge of the scene. Within hours, a preliminary determination had been made. The investigators' theory, which they would maintain through every subsequent investigation, was this. Kendrick had stored a pair of Adidas shoes inside the hollow center of the roll mat, as some students apparently did to avoid paying for a school locker. He had come to the gym on the afternoon of January 10th to retrieve the shoes. He had climbed up and leaned into the top of the mat to reach them. He had fallen in, become stuck upside down in the narrow space, and died from positional asphyxia, the compression of his chest and the restriction of his breathing that comes from being held inverted in a confined space over time. It was, in the official view, a tragic and bizarre accident. Within 24 hours of the discovery of Kendrick Johnson's body, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office had closed the case as an accidental death. 24 hours. The first autopsy, and the questions that would not die. On January 14, 2013, 3 days after Kendrick Johnson's body was discovered, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation performed an autopsy. The GBI's medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was positional asphyxia, confirming the sheriff's office's accident theory. The manner of death was listed as accidental. Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson were not satisfied. They would never be satisfied with this conclusion, and their reasons were not simply the natural, understandable refusal of grieving parents to accept the loss of their child. Their reasons were specific, concrete, and grounded in things they had seen and things they had been told. The condition of Kendrick's body when they were allowed to see it at the funeral home was deeply disturbing. His face was massively swollen, grotesquely, visibly deformed in a way that his parents and those who knew him found impossible to reconcile with the image of a boy who had died simply from being stuck in a mat. His parents released a photograph of Kendrick's face as it appeared at the funeral home. The photo was shocking. It showed a young man whose face was so distorted by swelling that he was barely recognizable. The public was horrified when they saw it. Supporters and advocates began rallying around the Johnson family, demanding answers. There was also the blood. A black and white gym shoe. The shoe the investigators said Kendrick had been reaching for had been found lying in a pool of blood at the base of the mat cluster. But the shoe itself had no blood on it. How could a shoe lie in a pool of blood and have none of that blood on it? The investigators had no satisfying answer. There was the matter of the mat's dimensions. An official report from the sheriff's office, released years later during the reopened investigation, included measurements indicating that the opening at the top of the mat was only 14 inches wide. Kendrick Johnson's shoulder width was measured at 19 inches. If the opening was narrower than his shoulders, how had he fallen into it head first? This was not a question raised by conspiracy theorists or by grieving parents looking for problems. It was a discrepancy documented in the official investigative records. There was a coroner's own discomfort. Lowndes County Coroner Bill Watson, who attended the scene, later expressed that the investigative climate was very poor to worse when I arrived on scene and that law enforcement did not cooperate with him. He noted that Kendrick's body had been moved before he arrived and that the sealed body bag had been opened. These are significant procedural failures: contamination of a scene, movement of a body, non-cooperation between agencies that would be troubling in any death investigation and that were particularly troubling in a case where the manner of death was, from the beginning, questioned. And then there was the surveillance footage. The gymnasium at Lowndes High School was covered by security cameras, 35 cameras across the school, with multiple cameras in and around the gymnasium area. In November 2013, CNN obtained nearly 300 hours of surveillance footage through a court order. A forensic analyst hired by CNN reviewed the footage and found that tapes from 2 cameras were missing 1 hour and 5 minutes of footage, while another set was missing 2 hours and 10 minutes of footage. The gaps were in the time window most relevant to Kendrick's death. Investigators who supported the accident theory would later offer technical explanations for the gaps, but the family and their supporters found those explanations insufficient. Most strikingly, the cameras that should have shown the area directly around the mats were, by the family's description and by the CNN analyst's assessment, either absent, unfocused, or producing footage of limited use. The most critical period, whatever happened in or near those mats on the afternoon of January 10, 2013, was either not captured or not preserved. The second autopsy, blunt force trauma and missing organs. The Johnson family, deeply unsatisfied with the GBI's findings and with the rushed manner in which the official investigation had been concluded, began working to secure an independent examination of their son's body. In May 2013, a judge granted their request to have Kendrick exhumed. On June 15, 2013, a private pathologist named Dr. William I. Anderson, working for Forensic Dimensions in Heathrow, Florida, conducted a second autopsy. What Dr. Anderson found changed everything about the public perception of the case and raised new questions that the official investigation had never addressed. First, he found evidence of blunt force trauma. Specifically, he identified hemorrhaging on the right side of Kendrick's neck, bruising and tissue damage consistent with significant impact to that area. He found traces of blunt force trauma in the soft tissues of the neck. His conclusion was that the evidence indicated this death was not accidental. He stated his findings as unexplained apparent non-accidental blunt force trauma and concluded that the manner of death should be classified as a homicide. This was a direct and total contradiction of the GBI's findings. 2 qualified pathologists, examining the same body, had come to diametrically opposite conclusions. The GBI said accidental. Dr. Anderson said homicide. The GBI said positional asphyxia from being stuck in a mat. Dr. Anderson said blunt force to the neck. Both autopsies were performed by credentialed professionals. Both sets of findings were documented. But the second revelation was the one that horrified the country more than any other single discovery in the entire Kendrick Johnson case. Kendrick's organs were gone. When Dr. Anderson's team examined the body, they found that every major internal organ, the heart, the lungs, the liver, and every other organ from the top of the chest to the pelvis, was absent. Not present, not returned, gone. In their place, filling the cavity that should have held Kendrick Johnson's organs, was newspaper. Old newspaper, stuffed inside his body before the remains had been returned to his family for burial. Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson had buried their son believing they were burying their son. They had not buried their son. They had buried an empty shell of him, stuffed with newspaper, without knowing it, without being told, without being asked. Kenneth Johnson, speaking publicly about the discovery, said, "When we buried Kendrick, we thought we were burying Kendrick, not half of Kendrick." The funeral home that had prepared Kendrick's body after the FBI's autopsy told investigators that they had never received his internal organ from the coroner. According to the funeral home, the organs had been destroyed through natural process and discarded by the prosector before the body was sent back to Valdosta. A subsequent investigation by the Georgia Secretary of State's office found that the funeral home had not followed best practice in how it filled the void left by the missing organs. The investigation noted that other material was more acceptable than newspaper. But the investigation cleared the funeral home of wrongdoing. The GBI, for its part, stated and maintained that the organs had been returned with the body. Two official positions, directly contradictory. The organs that could have been tested for toxicological evidence, that could have provided additional forensic information about Kendrick's death, were gone. Whether they were destroyed, lost, or taken, the family never received a satisfying answer. Dr. Anderson's findings and the discovery of the missing organs changed the public conversation around the case dramatically. What had been a local story about a tragic accident in a Georgia high school became a national story about the possible murder of a black teenager, the failure of local investigators to take it seriously, and the shocking discovery that the boy's body had been processed and returned to his family with its organs removed and replaced with newspaper. Valdosta, race, and the question of equal justice. To understand the Kendrick Johnson case fully, it is necessary to understand the context in which it happened. Valdosta, Georgia, sits in the southernmost part of the state, about 15 miles from the Florida border, in Lowndes County. It is a city of roughly 60,000 people, a mid-sized southern city with a significant African-American population, and, in 2013, a law enforcement establishment that was all white at the level of the investigators handling this case. The Johnson family's attorney, Shaveen King, said plainly what many observers were thinking, that if Kendrick Johnson had been white, the investigation would have been handled differently. He would not have been ruled an accidental death within 24 hours. The scene would not have been compromised by moving the body and opening the sealed body bag before the coroner arrived. The surveillance footage would not have had gaps. The case would not have been closed before the family had any chance to raise questions. This is not a claim that can be proven definitively. It is a claim about systems and tendencies and historical patterns, about the documented reality that in the American South, and in American law enforcement more broadly, the deaths of black teenagers have historically been treated with less urgency, less rigor, and less presumption of serious investigation than the deaths of white teenagers. Whether that pattern applied in Kendrick Johnson's case is something each person who examines the evidence must judge for themselves. But the pattern exists, and it would be dishonest to discuss this case without acknowledging it. The racial dynamics of the case became more visible and more contentious as the months passed. Civil rights advocates traveled to Valdosta to support the Johnson family. National figures, including civil rights attorneys and political leaders, raised the case as an example of the systemic failure of local law enforcement to take the deaths of black young people seriously. The Johnson family drew a direct comparison to the case of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy murdered in Mississippi in 1955 whose mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisted on an open casket funeral and allowed his mutilated body to be photographed and published in Jet magazine so the world would know what had been done to her child. Jacqueline Johnson made the same decision for her son, releasing the photograph of Kendrick's swollen, disfigured face because she felt the world needed to see what had happened to him and how his body had been treated. "I'll never let them forget," she told documentary filmmakers. The racial dimension of the case was also present in who the Johnson family believed was responsible for their son's death, and in whether those individuals' identities and connections had anything to do with why the investigation was conducted the way it was. The Bell brothers and the FBI agent. At the center of the Johnson family's theory of the case were two white brothers who were students at Lowndes High School at the same time as Kendrick, Brian Bell and Brandon Bell. Their father, Rick Bell, was at the time a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned to the Savannah, Georgia office. The Johnsons alleged that Brian Bell had previously been in a physical altercation with Kendrick, an incident that had reportedly occurred on a school bus about a year before Kendrick's death. According to Kenneth Johnson, Kendrick had told him about a follow-up incident in which Rick Bell, the FBI agent, had approached Kendrick on school property and told him that the fight on the bus had not been fair and that he should come to their house and have a rematch with Brian. Kendrick had, according to his father, walked away. Rick Bell denied that this encounter had ever occurred. The family alleged that Brian Bell and possibly Brandon Bell had confronted Kendrick in or near the gymnasium on January 10th. 2013, that there had been a violent altercation, that Kendrick had died from injuries sustained during that altercation, and that his body had been placed in the mat afterward to simulate an accidental death. They further alleged that Rick Bell, using his connections in federal law enforcement, had influenced and corrupted the official investigation to prevent his sons from being charged. These were serious allegations. They were never proven in court. The Bell brothers consistently and emphatically denied any involvement in Kendrick's death. In interviews with Atlanta television stations, Brian Bell said directly, "No, he was one of my good friends." Brandon Bell said, "Me and my brother have been innocent and always will be innocent." Rick Bell also denied the family's allegations completely. The official investigation supported the brothers' denials. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office stated that at least one of the Bell brothers was not on campus when Kendrick was last seen on surveillance footage entering the gym. The FBI's own investigation, conducted separately, found that Brian and Brandon Bell were in different areas of the school when Kendrick entered the gym, not near the mats. The Department of Justice, when it concluded its review in 2016, made no findings against the Bell brothers. But documentary filmmaker Jason Pollock, who spent years researching the case for his 2021 film Finding Kendrick Johnson, found something that he said had been buried in the FBI's own reports. In the FBI's 2014 analysis report, a document that had been publicly available but had not received significant attention, Pollock found a reference to surveillance footage showing Brian Bell and Kendrick Johnson standing approximately 4 feet apart in a covered walkway of the school on the afternoon of Kendrick's death. The FBI report itself noted, Kendrick Johnson is observed in a covered walkway moving towards a camera. Bell is observed in the same location at this time. This was significant for one reason. Brian Bell had told local media in multiple interviews that he had not seen Kendrick on the day he died. If the FBI's own report documented them in the same location at approximately the same time, and Bell had repeatedly said he had not seen Kendrick that day, then Bell had at minimum been inaccurate in those statements, and that inaccuracy had been documented in an FBI report that neither the local investigation nor the federal review had made central to their findings. Pollock's finding did not prove what the Johnson family alleged. Proximity in a hallway is not evidence of violence. But it complicated the picture in a way that the official investigations had not fully addressed, and it gave the Johnson family renewed ground to argue that the full truth of what happened that afternoon had not been established. Rick Bell eventually resigned from the FBI. His house was raided and searched for evidence as part of one of the investigations. He was never charged with any crime. The Bell brothers were never charged with any crime. They remain, in the official record, not suspects, persons who were investigated and cleared. The federal investigation, Hope and Disappointment. In October 2013, in response to the independent autopsy's findings and the growing national attention on the case, Michael Moore, the United States Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, announced that his office would open a formal review into Kendrick Johnson's death. This was significant. A federal review meant federal resources, federal authority, and the ability to investigate not just the death itself, but also whether any federal laws, specifically civil rights laws, had been violated in connection with it. The announcement was met with relief and cautious optimism by the Johnson family and their supporters. The local investigation had been, in their view and in the view of many independent observers, inadequate. Perhaps the federal government, with its greater resources and independence from local pressures, would find what the local investigators had not. The federal investigation was conducted partly by the U.S. Attorney's Office and partly by FBI agents, a fact that the Johnson family noted with some discomfort given their allegation that an FBI agent connections had corrupted the local investigation. The Middle District of Georgia's U.S. Attorney recused itself during the investigation, and the case was eventually transferred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio. The federal review lasted nearly 3 years. On June 20th, 2016, the Department of Justice announced its conclusion. They would not be filing any criminal charges. The statement read, "After extensive investigation into this tragic event, federal investigators determined that there is insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people willfully violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights or committed any other prosecutable federal crime." The Johnson family was devastated. They had put enormous faith in the federal process, had waited nearly 3 years for its conclusion, and had received what felt to them like the same answer they had always received. Not enough. Not sufficient. Close the case. Move on. Kendrick Johnson, speaking after the announcement, said he believed his son's death was being covered up. He was not willing to accept the conclusion. He was not willing to stop fighting. He was wearing a T-shirt that read, "Kendrick Johnson didn't roll himself up into Nomad." The federal investigation's conclusion did not resolve the contradictions in the evidence. It did not explain the missing organs. It did not explain the blood outside the mat with no blood on the shoe. It did not explain the mat opening that was narrower than Kendrick's shoulders. It did not explain the surveillance footage gaps. It said, simply, that there was not sufficient evidence to support federal criminal charges. These are different things. The absence of sufficient evidence for prosecution is not the same as a determination that nothing wrong happened. The lawsuits, a family's fight in the courts. Where the criminal investigation closed and no charges filed, Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson turned to the civil courts as their remaining avenue for accountability. Over the years following their son's death, they filed a series of lawsuits that collectively named dozens of defendants and made sweeping allegations about the nature of the conspiracy they believed had killed their son and hidden the truth. Their first major civil action named 38 individuals as defendants, including classmates of Kendrick's, local law enforcement officials, school administrators, state officials, federal officials, and FBI agent Rick Bell. The lawsuit alleged that Kendrick had been murdered, that the Bell brothers had been directly responsible for his death, and that Rick Bell and a network of co-conspirators in law enforcement and government had covered it up. The lawsuit sought $100 million in damages. The lawsuit attracted enormous public attention and gave the family's allegations a formal legal framework. But in court, it ran into serious problems. During deposition testimony, the phase of litigation where parties must answer questions under oath, Kendrick Johnson admitted that he had no direct evidence to support the claims made in the lawsuit. The evidence he was relying on was circumstantial or came from second-hand accounts or could not be verified. Georgia Judge Richard Porter, ruling on the case, wrote that testimony shows that they had no evidence to support their claims that the brothers killed Johnson or that any of the other defendants engaged in conspiracy to conceal the cause or manner of Johnson's death. The lawsuit was withdrawn, and then, in a turn of events that the Johnson family described as deeply unjust, Judge Porter ordered them and their attorney to pay more than $292,000 in legal fees to the dozens of defendants they had accused without sufficient evidence. Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson, a working-class couple who had lost their son and were fighting with everything they had for answers, were ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to the people they had accused. Jacqueline Johnson told a reporter afterward, "It's like we're having to pay for my son being murdered." They did not stop. They filed more lawsuits. A wrongful death suit was filed against local school administrators. A complaint was filed against the funeral home. And in September of a subsequent year, they filed another federal lawsuit, this one seeking $1 billion, against the Lone County Sheriff's Office, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Lowndes County Medical Examiner, and others. This lawsuit argued that their civil rights had been violated through the inadequate and biased investigation into their son's death. In 2025, that lawsuit was dismissed by a federal judge, though the judge noted concern about the inconsistencies that remained in the case. The dismissal was based on a combination of procedural grounds, defendants that could not legally be sued, statute of limitations issues, and sovereign immunity protections, rather than on a determination that the family's allegations had no merit. The family immediately filed notice of appeal and declared they would continue fighting. A federal appeals court, reviewing a related earlier dismissal, had already ordered a lower court to reconsider because some of the procedural errors that led to dismissal, specifically, the naming of entities that could not be sued instead of the entities that should have been named, could be fixed. The case was sent back. The family was still in court. The case reopened. Sheriff Polk and the reward. In March 2021, 8 years after Kendrick Johnson's death, the case was officially reopened. The person who reopened it was Lowndes County Sheriff Ashley Polk, a different sheriff from the one who had handled the original investigation. Polk had not been in office in January 2013. He came to the case without the institutional stake in the original conclusion that his predecessor had, and he came with a specific motivation. He had received persistent public pressure about the case from community members and advocates, and he felt that the Johnson family deserved a thorough second look. Polk did something remarkable and unusual. He put up $500,000 of his own personal money as a reward for information leading to the conviction of anyone who had killed Kendrick Johnson. This was not law enforcement money. This was not public money. This was Sheriff Polk reaching into his own bank account and placing $500,000 on the table as a statement that he was serious about finding the truth. He and 2 other investigators spent 13 months going through the case file. They reviewed every piece of evidence, every autopsy, every witness statement, every surveillance record. They consulted with experts. They interviewed people. They examined the physical evidence and the forensic record in as much detail as a passage of time, now 8 years, allowed. In January 2022, Sheriff Polk released his findings. His conclusion was the same as every previous conclusion. No homicide, no cover-up, no conspiracy. He wrote, "It was simply a tragic and bizarre accident." He stated that the 2 brothers who had been named in the family's lawsuits were not suspects. He stated that because so many federal and local agencies had been involved in the case, it would have been impossible to conceal any evidence in any genuine conspiracy. He also acknowledged the limitations of his findings. He acknowledged that some people would never accept the accident conclusion. He acknowledged that the case had been handled poorly in some respect at the scene in 2013. He acknowledged the concerns that had been raised. But he maintained that the evidence, taken as a whole, supported the accident theory. The Johnson family rejected his conclusion. They said they were grateful the case had been reopened, but that the finding did not reflect what the evidence showed. Kendrick Johnson said he believed the cover-up continued. The $500,000 reward was never claimed. The documentaries and the witness who said he heard a confession. As the legal battles continued and the official investigations concluded without satisfying the family or the public, documentary filmmakers turned to the Kendrick Johnson case as a subject worthy of extended investigation. The most prominent of these efforts was Jason Pollock's 2021 film Finding Kendrick Johnson, which received a perfect score from critics on Rotten Tomatoes and was praised as one of the most important true crime documentaries of recent years. It also received, as Pollock noted bitterly, almost no attention from major media outlets. Pollock spent years researching the case. He obtained documents, interviewed witnesses, analyzed the FBI's reports, and brought new evidence to light, including the surveillance footage showing Brian Bell in proximity to Kendrick on the afternoon of his death, contradicting Bell's public statements that he had not seen Kendrick that day. The documentary did not claim to solve the case definitively, but it built a detailed and serious argument that the official conclusion was wrong and that the official investigations had been inadequate. The film also drew parallels that the Johnson family themselves had drawn, to Emmett Till, to Trayvon Martin, to the long and painful history of black deaths in America that were not treated with the urgency and thoroughness they deserved. It situated Kendrick Johnson's death not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a pattern that filmmaker Jason Pollock argued had allowed the truth about what happened in that gymnasium to remain obscured. There was also, in the years of legal wrangling, a strange and contested episode involving a man named Dalton Ray Chauncey. Chauncey told neighbors that he had overheard 2 students at Lone High School discussing their involvement in Kendrick's death. The story made its way to investigators. When law enforcement looked into it, they found inconsistencies in Chauncey's account. He was indicted on a felony charge of making a false statement to investigators. His mother said he was bipolar and was being used as a scapegoat. The Johnson family's attorney filed a statement citing Chauncey as a potential witness with relevant information. Chauncey was later arrested on a trespassing charge after attempting to access property related to the case. Jacqueline Johnson called the trespassing arrest bogus and characterized it as an attempt to silence a potential witness. Whether Chauncey had genuine information or was an unstable person whose claims could not be verified, this remains unresolved. He was indicted for making false statements. The indictment did not lead to a conviction that advanced the family's case, but the episode added another layer of confusion and controversy to an already deeply complicated record. The ongoing legal battle, where the case stands. More than 12 years after Kendrick Johnson was found dead in a rolled gym mat at Lone High School, his parents are still fighting in the courts. The federal appeals court ruling in 2024 revived a portion of their lawsuit by finding that a lower court had been too hasty in dismissing it on procedural grounds, that the procedural errors, specifically the naming of entities that could not be sued as defendants, could be fixed and the substance of the claims deserved to be heard. This ruling was widely reported as a win for the family, though it was a procedural win rather than a finding on the merits. In 2025, another federal judge dismissed a related lawsuit, acknowledging concern about the inconsistencies in the case while ruling that the technical and legal barriers to proceeding were too significant to overcome. The family filed notice of appeal immediately. The litigation has been financially ruinous for the Johnson family. They were ordered to pay nearly $300,000 in legal fees after their first major lawsuit was withdrawn. They have spent years and enormous resources on legal battles that have, so far, not produced the criminal accountability they sought. They have had to exhume their son's body 3 times, subjecting themselves to the raw grief of that process again and again, in the pursuit of evidence that might finally be sufficient to compel a different outcome. Kendrick Johnson, appearing at public events and speaking to journalists throughout these years, has maintained an unwavering certainty that his son was murdered and that the people responsible have never been held accountable. He wears T-shirts bearing his son's image. He speaks at rallies. He sits for interviews. He says again and again that he will not stop. Jacqueline Johnson has said the same. She traveled to Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Kendrick Johnson Foundation to press the case publicly. She has described the stun gun marks that she believes were found on her son's body. She has kept the public's attention on the case through force of will and the specificity of her grief. They have built a foundation in Kendrick's name. They have spoken to members of Congress. They have worked with documentary filmmakers and journalists and civil rights organizations. They have done everything that grieving parents with limited resources can do when they believe the institutions responsible for protecting their child have failed him. The unanswered questions. Let us set out, plainly and without embellishment, the questions that remain unanswered in the death of Kendrick Johnson. These are not the questions of conspiracy theorists or people who simply cannot accept a difficult truth. These are questions grounded in documented evidence that has been acknowledged even by the official investigation. First, how did Kendrick get into the mat? If the opening at the top of the mat was 14 inches wide and Kendrick's shoulder width was 19 inches, the physical mechanics of the accident theory are difficult to reconcile. How does a boy with 19-inch shoulders fall headfirst into a 14-inch opening? This discrepancy appears in the sheriff's own report. No official investigation has satisfactorily resolved it. Second, why was there blood on the floor outside the mat and none on the shoe? If Kendrick fell into the mat reaching for a shoe that had fallen inside, and if the shoe was found in the blood pool outside the mat, then the shoe and the blood pool are not in the locations the accident theory predicts they should be. The official investigation has not fully resolved this. Third, what happened to the organs? Whether the GBI returned them with the body and the funeral home failed to keep them, or whether the GBI discarded them before returning the body, someone failed catastrophically in the handling of evidence that might have been critical to establishing the true cause of death. No one has been held accountable for this failure. Fourth, what explains the gaps in the surveillance footage? The official investigation offered explanations involving camera settings and recording schedules. The CNN forensic analyst found these explanations insufficient. The gaps in footage covering the most relevant time window and the most relevant locations remain, in the view of many independent observers, unexplained. Fifth, did Brian Bell see Kendrick Johnson on the afternoon of January 10, 2013? Bell said repeatedly in media interviews that he had not. The FBI's own 2014 analysis report described them in the same location at approximately the same time. Someone is wrong, or someone is not telling the full truth. This contradiction was documented in federal records and was never made central to either the local or federal investigation's public conclusions. 6. What was the significance of the swelling on Kendrick's face? Positional asphyxia does not typically produce the kind of facial swelling documented in the photographs released by the family. Independent pathologist Dr. Anderson attributed the swelling to blunt force trauma. The GBI attributed it to decomposition. Medical experts who have reviewed the photographs publicly have disagreed about its cause. These 6 questions do not, individually or together, prove that Kendrick Johnson was murdered, but they demonstrate that the official conclusion, accident, closed case, nothing to see, was not arrived at through a complete and rigorous examination of all available evidence. They demonstrate that important evidence was mishandled or is missing. They demonstrate that there are legitimate, documented reasons to doubt the official account. What Kendrick Johnson's story demands. Kendrick Lamai Johnson was 17 years old, a wrestler and an honor roll student, a boy who was always where he was supposed to be, who did not come home one afternoon in January 2013, and was found the next morning inside a gym mat in his high school gymnasium. The official verdict is that he died accidentally trying to get a shoe. The official verdict has been reached multiple times by multiple agencies, and it has not brought peace to anyone. His parents are still fighting. His body has been exhumed 3 times. His organs are missing. The surveillance footage has gaps. The shoe was in a pool of blood without a drop of blood on it. The mat's opening was smaller than his shoulders. The second autopsy found blunt force trauma. The FBI's own report placed a person of interest in the same hallway as Kendrick on the day he died, and that person had repeatedly told the media he had not seen Kendrick that day. None of these facts have been adequately explained by any official investigation. The Kendrick Johnson case is not simply a mystery. It is a mirror. It reflects back something about the state of justice in America, particularly for black families in the Deep South, particularly for parents who do not have powerful connections or unlimited financial resources, and particularly in cases where the death of a young person is deemed, within 24 hours, to be an accident, and where the institutions supposedly investigating the death have motivations of their own that may not align perfectly with the truth. The comparison to Emmett Till that the Johnson family has drawn is not hyperbole. Both cases involve the death of a black teenager in circumstances that the family found suspicious. Both cases involved official conclusions that the family rejected. Both cases involve a mother's decision to show the world what had been done to her child's body because she believed that only by making the horror visible could she compel the country to pay attention. And in both cases, the question of whether American justice is equally available to black families and white families, whether the system that is supposed to protect everyone protects everyone equally, is a question at the heart of everything. Whether Kendrick Johnson was murdered, and if so by whom, is a question this narrative cannot answer with certainty. The evidence is contested. The investigations are concluded without charges. The courts have largely dismissed the family's lawsuits on procedural grounds while acknowledging remaining questions. The full truth may be available somewhere in the documentary record, in the FBI files that have never been fully released, in the surveillance footage that may or may not have gaps for innocent reasons, in the testimony of people who were in that gymnasium or near it on the afternoon of January 10th, 2013, or it may be genuinely unrecoverable at this point, 12 years later. What can be said with certainty is this: the investigation that was supposed to find the truth about Kendrick Johnson's death failed. It failed in its handling of the scene. It failed in its preservation of evidence. It failed in the speed with which it declared the case closed. Whether it failed through incompetence, through indifference, through racial bias, through corruption, or through some combination of all of these, it failed. And that failure meant that Kendrick Johnson's parents buried their son without knowing how he really died, without knowing who was responsible, and without the justice that every human life, and particularly every murdered human life, deserves. We are going to continue to keep fighting for Kendrick because his life mattered, Jacqueline Johnson said after one of the many court hearings that have marked these 12 years of struggle. She was right then. She is right now. His life mattered. And the truth about how it ended matters too. The search for that truth, however much it has cost the Johnson family and however much it has been resisted by the institutions that should have provided it, is not over. It will not be over until somebody answers the 6 questions that a gym mat, a pool of blood, a missing pair of organs, and a 17-year-old boy's swollen face have been asking since January 11, 2013.